Welcome back to the Metahumanism podcast and channel. Today we will start discussing the definition of metahumanism, starting with its origins in the classical humanist tradition. For those new to my channel, I am Bohdan, and if you haven't watched my first two introductory videos yet and want to learn more about who I am, also about the definition of philosophy and its main branches, I encourage you to watch those two videos when you get a chance. You won't lose it if you watch it after this, or I will be referring to them, but it's not a problem. The third video in the introductory series about myself, this channel, and what to expect. The first thing I want to mention is to reiterate something that I said in one of my shorts last week about postcolonialism, which I have added that as a third major perspective that I will be using on this channel to philosophize. That's my perspective. The other two being metahumanism and metamodernism. So the postcolonialism is the third that I added. I decided to add that explicitly because it flows out quite naturally from who I am as a Ukrainian American, from my Ukrainian identity. Ukraine's history is full of, its history is a prolonged colonial domination by Russia, Russian and Soviet empires. They're kind of two different regimes, but the same Moscow, the Kremlin, the same center of the empire. So that history is marked by repeated attempts to erase that Ukrainian identity, to destroy the language, the culture, the people. The events of the recent decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union are best understood through the lens of postcolonialism. The continued struggle to decolonize Ukraine and to heal from all the historical traumas the Ukrainian people have and Ukrainian nation has sustained through the years and through the centuries. Most recently, the 20th century, you can Stalin's genocide, the Holodomor, close to 4 million people died in the famine. Stalin engineered famine. Then the two world wars, much of the fighting was happening on Ukrainian territory, and the legacies of totalitarian system before and after World War II. So some parts of Ukraine were within the Soviet system even before World War II. The western part was not. It was under Polish rule in the interwar period. Before that, in Austro-Hungarian, under Austro-Hungarian rule, the empire which fell apart as a result of World War I. So that those traumas are all real, and they have intergenerational effects, and obviously, genocide, war, and leaves its mark for many years, many decades. Generally speaking, Ukraine's task is to decolonize its history and culture while constructing a new, contemporary, meaning in a sense of new, free and independent national identity. I'm saying it's not new, meaning that our culture and history is long, and we have traditions. Ukrainians didn't have the continuous tradition of statehood, but as a nation, as a people, as an ethnicity and a culture, Ukrainian reaches back into the Middle Ages, just as most European and most other nations in the world do. We have a long prehistory. It just that history needs to be decolonized because it has been the imperial narratives spread by Russia for many years and decades and centuries have created false history from which distorts the Ukrainian experience. So with time. Oh, and basically, what the war between Ukraine and Russia is about, in that sense, is about this post-colonial struggle, a struggle to decolonize. Russia wants to continue controlling Ukraine by any means necessary. It tried everything, political means, interfering in politics, underhanded, all kinds of business transactions and oligarchy, trying to influence Ukrainian politics and society without open war. But when that failed with the Euromaidan movement, then the next step was just to start a war and invade Crimea and then eastern Ukraine, and then again in 2022. That's just an imperial aggression based on imperial desire for imperial domination. That's as simple as that. That's the reason for this war, and that's the underlying logic that fuels this war. So anybody who does not understand that is bound to fail to address the issues that are at the core of this conflict. As I will demonstrate in due time, throughout my videos and my future episodes, all three perspectives, the metahumanism, metamodernism, and postcolonialism, they overlap quite significantly in many areas, even though they were developed by different people, different thinkers, and independently of one another. This tends to happen in philosophy or in intellectual pursuits when different thinkers engage with some of the similar issues, employ similar methods of investigation, and are influenced by similar experiences historically and also by the same past thinkers. People may read the same philosopher and be affected in similar ways, but don't have any connection on the surface of it other than reading that philosopher and thinking along the same lines, albeit maybe in slightly different aspects. So that's why, one is metamodernism, it's going beyond modernism. Metahumanism is going beyond humanism, and then postcolonialism is some moving beyond, or seeing colonialism as a thing of the past. And that's a point which we will look at in the future episode, because it's arguably colonialism has not disappeared completely, so post-colonialism may be too optimistic of a perspective, and so there are certain perspectives which are called meta-colonialism. So it's a new variation of colonialism, and we'll talk about that next time. Today there's a different topic. We're looking at classical humanism and the origins of humanist tradition. So let's begin. In the last video, we covered the last episode. I should get used to saying maybe episode is a better way to describe for those who are just listening as a podcast and not watching. We covered the definition of philosophy and its 5 main branches: metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ethics, and aesthetics. So reality, truth, just in one word summary: reality, truth, reasoning, ethics, it's conduct, morality, and beauty. So standards of beauty. In addition, in another short video last week, I added some thoughts about there being specialized areas of philosophy in addition to those 5 major branches, such as political philosophy, philosophy of religion, language, mind, and so on. And we will look at those areas throughout our episodes as we explore various issues and talk about different issues and ideas and current events and perspectives. Because these branches are sort of it's not arbitrary, but these are contingent. Thinking involves sometimes several of these branches at once, and they interpenetrate and interrelate, and they're not isolated and separated by any rigid boundaries. As I said, thought flows, it's alive, it's a living thing, we as living beings think, and it's part of life, so it does not follow strict rules or strictly defined boundaries in any natural way. So the next question I want to look at, what kind of philosophy is metahumanism, right? But before we even get to the metahumanism part, we need to understand what humanism, classical plain humanism, is. If you ask, let's say, ChatGPT or some other AI model out there to define it for you and to summarize it for you, you might find out that there as much in the Western civilization, humanism began with Greeks. It all began with the Greeks, the ancient Greeks. Philosophy was born in ancient Greece, and including the first proto-humanist ideas. Nothing like explicit humanism as defined that way existed back in ancient times, but the ideas were formulated the first time in ancient Greece, and later picked up by the Romans and transmitted to the Christian Europe in the Middle Ages and so forth, and the Renaissance. So such ideas and practices as reasoned skepticism, rational investigation, and ethical concerns about the good life or how the right conduct in life were among the many fundamental ideas and methods that bequeathed to us by the Greeks. Some of the relevant thinkers here were Protagoras, for example. He was a sophist, sophist philosopher, credited with saying that man is the measure of all things. That's the most concise summary of a certain relativism and anthropocentrism, meaning the human-centeredness inherent in classical humanist thought. So relativism being man decides, measures things, so it's man that is at the center of everything, right? At the universe or thinking. That's centralizes humanity as being the center of the universe in a way. Then there was the classical trio, besides Protagoras, there was a classical trio of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the three kind of most influential and major philosophers from ancient Greece. They emphasized the ethical use of human reason. That was their focus. Then there was the Epicureans, the school of Epicureans, who emphasized materialism. They saw the world as materialist, based in material things, first of all, and so they rejected divine intervention in the world and focused on this life. And last but not least, there were the Stoics, another major school that also had a very important influence on Christianity and its development. And so especially the Roman Stoics such as Cicero and Seneca, who emphasized human virtue. So those were the several influences, proto-humanist influences in ancient Greece. In the Middle Ages, there were also some humanist elements in the Christian civilization, though the main focus of the medieval thinking was theological justification, primarily concerned with reconciling the earthly life to the postulates of Christian faith, to the principles of a city of God, of Saint Augustine, one of the early Christian philosophers, or the church fathers as they are known sometimes, or the otherworldly kingdom of heaven, right? So that was the main concern for Christianity in the Middle Ages, and that's what the thinkers within the Christian tradition focused their minds on, not so much about humanity at the center, but God and faith at the center, and how does humanity relate to it, and how does one live with focusing on God and kingdom of heaven and religion. Given that the Christian thinkers almost exclusively focused on faith and theology, as I said, with a few notable exceptions, of course. It was the golden age of Islam between the 8th century and the 13th century that played the crucial role of transmitting the ancient classical culture and knowledge on to the Renaissance Europe in the 13th century. During that half millennium between 8th and 13th centuries, the Islamic world, which was primarily represented by the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad. So that world experienced significant advancements in terms of science, medicine, mathematics, and culture in general. And the symbolic institution of that period was the so-called House of Wisdom in Baghdad. Scholars translated a lot of things, texts there, built upon the ancient knowledge and innovated. That's the key thing, is that they didn't just transmit the old knowledge, they added their own new ideas to the old knowledge that pre-existed them, which they received from the ancient world. So that was the knowledge they passed on and transmitted to the European humanists in the 13th century. Now, the Islamic Golden Age ended and was destroyed at the same time in the 13th century by the Mongol invasion. And there's a connection here to the history of Ukraine, because the Kievan Rus, the medieval state that existed in the territory of what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and part of Russia, that fragmented and was destroyed also by the Mongol invasion, with several key exceptions, which one of them I mentioned in my very first video. I talked about this, so about the Galician Volhynian kingdom that survived and the Mongol invasion. But many of the other principalities, they fractured and they were defeated. Kyiv was sacked by the Mongols, and they became vassal, completely subdued by the Mongol horde, as it is known. In the future, I plan to look specifically at the development of humanism within the Ukrainian culture, which was based on a synthesis of a classical European humanism that I will be discussing next. With the Orthodox Christianity that was dominant in Eastern Europe. So the synthesis of the two created the uniquely Ukrainian type of humanism, and that we'll look at that separately in the future to complement what I discussed today. I want to underscore that without that mediation of the Islamic culture, medieval Islamic culture, the modern world would not look the way it does today, would not likely look the same way. It's obviously history is contingent. We cannot know what would happen if that transmission didn't happen between Islamic culture and Renaissance, but it did happen, and so here we are. So we have to acknowledge that, credit it, and it's often forgotten today, unfortunately, because or sometimes deliberately ignored, because of a lot of Islamophobic bigots that exist, demonize the entire religion of Islam, identifying it with a much narrower extremist ideologies that are espoused by the certain radical sects within Islam, the Islamist, radical Islamism, the political ideology, which is certainly it's based in religion, but it's to me it's abuse of religion. It's just and they engage in terrorism, but it's not Islam as such. And we can see in history, Islam, it does not have to be this violent or terrorist. It's not the same, and it cannot be identified as the same and should not be. So it's not undeniable that Islam does have certain number of problems with in terms of modernizing its views and practices, but ultimately it's a matter of how religion is interpreted and abused by bad or evil actors. It's not a matter of the whole entire religion being bad or evil. virtually any religion is liable to be abused, and such historical facts as, for example, the struggle for political power between the Pope and the Emperor in Europe, the Inquisition, the Crusades, these are just examples of how religion can be used or abused for political purposes, even when it's not Islam, right? So Christianity was used in some ways in history. Other religions as well. Some Buddhist monks are known to be violent, which is completely contrary to what Buddha taught, but it happens, you know, so the abuse of religion happens. It shouldn't be identified with religion as such. Okay, so the ancient wisdom and the Islamic innovation upon that wisdom was communicated to Europe, and Renaissance humanism proper finally emerged in Italy in the 13th century and lasted until about 15th century. That's the heyday of Italian humanism. Later, the focus, the center, I guess, of development moved northward from Italy, flourishing also in such countries as the Netherlands, France, and England, among others, and in 15th and 16th centuries. So what was it? Humanism was a comprehensive reform movement aiming to restructure the entire system of beliefs and practices in society, refocusing it again on reason, individualism, and critical thinking. Right, from the medieval, more like mystical and ritualistic and theological thinking. It was formulated to reform the passive, the deterministic, the ignorant, and otherworldly views of the medieval Christianity, because of this received knowledge, as people and thinkers starting to be more exposed to these new texts and new works transmitted from the Islamic Golden Age, they started developing new ideas and coming back to the proto-humanist ideas of the ancient Greeks. And that's the reason the Middle Ages sometimes are known as the Dark Ages. They weren't really dark. There were also moments of enlightenment and knowledge, and which, it's not a topic of our discussion, but it's known as dark in comparison to what followed in Renaissance as a rebirth, right, of knowledge and learning and education. So to state the most basic premises of humanism, they were human dignity, human potential for progress, and individual free will and autonomy in shaping one's life in the here and now, right? So not focusing on the other world or the kingdom of heaven, but really focusing on this life here on earth and what you can do with your time while you live. At the same time, while in some ways it can be seen as a radical and avant-garde movement, although those terms weren't used back then, Renaissance humanism did not reject religion and Christianity and retained the connection to the Christian notion that the source of human dignity lies in the fact that humanity was created in the image of God. So that belief still was pretty prevalent and important and central to Renaissance humanism, and the source of dignity and free will was seen as coming from God, from the deity. From religion, right? So it wasn't rejected as it would be more explicitly in the Enlightenment period, but the seeds were definitely sown during this period in Renaissance, the seeds of the future Enlightenment hostility to tradition and religion, because some, such as Voltaire and other thinkers, they definitely were quite hostile to religion as such. So they were definitely sown during the Renaissance, these seeds, and humanism was, as I said, thoroughly anthropocentric perspective. So it returned to the previous human-centered perspective of the ancients. That idea of Protagoras that man is the measure of all things. So they placed the figure of human being at the center, defined it, and tried to make it focus of all thinking in a way. The very term Renaissance, which means rebirth or reawakening, referred to this revival of classical, pre-Christian, Greek, pagan, you can call Greek and Roman learning and thinking, following the transmission of this from the Middle Ages. Which were these teachings were temporarily lost to the European Middle Ages, and then were transmitted again and recovered. So that's the revival and renaissance of that knowledge and learning. That revival is really what I discussed in my previous episode, which I talked about rhetorics, about poetry, logic, grammar, ethics, human-centered history. All of that returned and became that part of education again during Renaissance, in force. It returned and it became the center of the focus for education and for politics and for thinking in general. For learning. This revival also signaled a return to social criticism and skepticism, empirical science based on experience and observation, the Socratic method of philosophical investigation, as advocated most enthusiastically by the Renaissance poet and philosopher Petrarch. He was the one who quoted Socrates and used this as his model. Other prominent thinkers of the period were Erasmus of Rotterdam, who famously wrote a satirical work called Praise of Folly, and Sir Thomas More, for example, who wrote the no less famous work Utopia, leaving us this legacy of this term to describe all idealized social or philosophical visions. I highly recommend reading all these, Petrarch, Thomas More, and Erasmus, reading these works if you haven't yet, to get a sense of what humanism is all about. And it's a really good good literature, good philosophy as well. The term humanism used to describe this broad and varied educational, political, and philosophical movement derives from a concept of humanitas, from Latin, which was proposed by the Roman statesman and thinker Cicero. He was a huge influence on Renaissance and following and the Enlightenment thinkers as well. It meant the fullest development of civic human virtue, which is actually a broader and more comprehensive notion than the modern concept of humanity. So the modern idea of humanity implies understanding of our interconnectedness as human beings, benevolence to one another, goodwill, right, compassion, mercy. Well, the ancient, in addition to these, the ancient and the revived Renaissance idea also included more assertive virtues such as fortitude, judgment, prudence, eloquence, and even love of honor. So these were just as important to emphasize for humanitas included those virtues. In that sense, someone with humanitas could not be a mere armchair philosopher or some literary figure who knew how to write well. They also had to lead an active, practical life. So action without philosophical insight was seen as aimless and barbaric, but at the same time, insight without action was rejected as being hollow and flawed, right? So humanitas called for a balance of action and contemplation, of doing and thinking, to use Latin terms, via activa and via contemplativa, but balance based on both sides of life, complementing each other. So not being separate, theory and practice, but being two sides of the same coin and in no way compromising the overall integrity of a human being, of a character, a person. This ancient emphasis on civic republican virtue was revived by a Florentine humanist and statesman, Leonardo Bruni, who wrote a work called Panegyric to the City of Florence, praising its liberty and civic engagement of its citizens in the process of governance. Bruni's philosophy influenced Niccolo Macchiavelli, who I'm sure many of you have heard about his thinking, his political thinking, and Machiavelli's work is widely considered, generally considered the founding moment for modern political theory, right? So modern politics, realist politics. This revived a Republican tradition, continued and developed through the Enlightenment, as I mentioned, and so there's a direct relevance to the founding fathers, for example, of the United States, who also read Cicero and ancient texts to get to guide their thinking and ethics. And by extension, so this republicanism is relevant to the current constitutional crisis in the United States, which is basically attacking the foundations of this civic republicanism as we speak. Now, the ancient Greeks produced a rich variety of philosophical perspectives on every aspect of the world, life, and human experience. At some point, I might make a video focusing specifically on that variety of ancient perspectives in the future episode. So for now, though, remember what I said in my last video, which was that philosophers will invariably disagree on every little thing as long as they have a chance to do so, right? So if they take a position on something, there will always be another school of thought arguing an opposite or some other perspective. So by 15th century, it's not surprising that this variety of study of this kind of classical variety also produced variety and tensions between different schools of thought in the Renaissance humanist tradition. The basic tensions, which I mentioned in my previous episodes, was between philosophy and history on one hand, and then poetry and mythology on the other. Was expressed also in the rifts between, in these new guises, between monarchists and republicans, between positivists and skeptics, between idealists and cynics. And these rifts endured through the ages and in modified forms persist with us even today, you could say. Maybe not in the same form, but you could trace some similarity back to Renaissance in some of these conflicts or opposing views. For example, you can think of the rifts between conservatives and liberals today as also it doesn't quite reach as far as Renaissance because the modern conservatism and liberalism dates primarily to the moment of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, so to the Enlightenment period, which produced both the modern liberal tradition and the modern conservative tradition, and we'll talk about that in the future. But some similarities and analogies could be drawn to the Renaissance between the conservative and liberal approaches, between science fanatics and religious fanatics, for example, between critical thinkers and dogmatists, between materialists and idealists, between Machiavellian realists and moralists, and so on. We can find different rifts and conflicts and tensions like that in modern political and philosophical thought. Just to make another connection to the present based on this very specific connection, I'll give you a contemporary example of this split between realists and moralists, right? So to approach to politics, realist is more the so-called quote-unquote, I call them realists, because there's really nothing that realist about it. It's very idealistic notion, meaning it's constructed in human thought and then implemented in the world. It's not natural. It doesn't come from the world by nature. And so the realist perspective is that international relations are based on just pure power, right? So power is the center, might is right, and that's the logic of international relations. That's not it's the naked power is not the only consideration in international politics, and that's what the more moralist perspectives tend to argue, that it's not just about power. The values matter, and sometimes decisions are made based on specific values, and freedom, democracy, whatever else you can think of, or other values, monarchy, support of monarchy. So it's not just about naked power and spheres of influence within geopolitics. There are other things that matter as well. And so such formerly eminent political scientists as John Mearsheimer, or economists such as Jeffrey Sachs, use their academic credentials and accrued symbolic capital, which I discussed what symbolic capital is in the previous episodes. They use that to argue that Russia was provoked, quote unquote, into invading Ukraine by USA and NATO, which is just a patently absurd thing to argue, and deeply at odds with reality. No matter what anybody will say, and there are people who try to argue and advance all kinds of arguments to support that position, but it is not in reality, and it is wrong. It is not. Nobody was provoked. Russia didn't. Russian aggression was not provoked directly by anything. It was just imperialist choice. And that's something important to understand. And of course, the explanation of why these people like Mearsheimer and Sachs say that is very simple, relatively simple, let's say. These two individuals have the unfortunate privilege of belonging to the Valdai Discussion Club, which is a sort of think tank which is sponsored by the Putin regime in Russia. It's a Russian think tank. Jeff Sachs is also a regular on the Chinese state TV, providing weekly commentary and expert opinion, and I use expert with certain emphasis, with some sarcasm also, about world economy and politics. He's just being a useful tool for them, in other words. Also to add, in 1993, John Mearsheimer, when USA was pressuring Ukraine to give up its nuclear arsenal, so after the Soviet Union fell apart, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It was on the territory of Ukraine, controlled by Ukraine. And so USA was pressuring for Ukraine to give it up. And Ukraine did give it up. In 1994, a Budapest Memorandum was signed. And at that time, John Mearsheimer, in 1993, before this happened, he published a paper arguing in favor of Ukraine keeping its nuclear weapons as a deterrent against possible Russian aggression in the future. He at that time in this paper wrote that it would be a disaster if Russia and Ukraine started a war, if a war erupted between those two nations. So somehow, since that time, he flipped his position completely, and today he's arguing the exact opposite of it. And although the events proved vindicated his thinking back in the day, so I will link to this to back up everything I'm saying, so you can investigate and make your own conclusions and make your own decisions on what to think. Now let's return to Renaissance. One important and central point of disagreement at the time became known as the Res-verbum controversy. It's from Latin, it means thing, word. So it focused around the nature of language. This word and thing controversy about language continues to be central to all of philosophy, really. That's why it's important to talk about it, and especially to such branches as metaphysics, epistemology, so study of reality and the truth and knowledge, and the philosophy of language, which is a specialized area. One side saw language as a mere tool to gain knowledge about the independent, deeper truths and the ultimate reality, so the objective reality, right? So language helps us get to the truth. While the other side saw language as the final arbiter of truth and reality in itself. So language creates reality in that school of thought. So that follows from the Protagoras idea that man is the measure of all things. So the sophists, they argued this second position. And so this latter perspective held truth to be relative, subjective, and based on one's perspective, ability to use language skillfully. So this controversy emerged at the center of philosophy with the opposition of Socrates, which supported the former view that there is an objective reality and truth, that our language helps us perceive and learn about or know. And then the sophists argued that the latter position about the subjectivity of language and the language creating reality. For reasons that we don't need to go into this time, the Renaissance humanism was relatively weak when it came to using Plato's. Plato was a philosopher who came after Socrates and wrote about Socrates. So he created this analytic method called dialectics, dialogical kind of investigation of within a dialogue, back and forth. We'll talk about that in the future videos. It's an important method, important to understand. But relatively, so the Renaissance humanism were weak on that method, using analysis and dialectics, but relatively strong on believing in Plato's idealism. And that was Plato's idea, a theory that the existence of that there was a parallel realm to the reality that we all perceive from experience. There is this perfect realm of reality of forms or ideas, capital I ideas, which we only can access by using reason and only imperfectly. So there is this perfect idea of a triangle, and we only can understand it by using our reason to think about triangles, right? So we never can perceive or achieve the perfection of that form that exists separately from us. So that's the kind of dualist understanding of the world. There's one world of experience and then completely separate world that is beyond experience and that is not accessible other than by using a reason correctly, right? By dialectical reason, by using it dialectically and achieving true truth that way. So dropping the method because they were weak on using the method, but believed in the theory of these forms and ideas, there was an imbalance in Renaissance thought, and so in the end, this word thing controversy ended with the word or the rhetorics winning over the philosophy or the thing itself, right? So the rhetorics became more predominant, and the idea that language is the center of it all and center of all existence became dominant eventually. Throughout this controversy ended with the rhetorics becoming dominant over philosophy, and so philosophical humanism kind of deteriorated and became more of just a literary tradition, but modern philosophy focused more on studying nature and natural science rather than thinking about humanity more broadly. So there was like this split happened, and that was kind of very important because to the future development of philosophy, modern philosophy, and humanities. As the Renaissance humanist movement fractured and declined, it was followed by the Baroque culture and the scientific revolution of the 16th and the 17th century. Francis Bacon was the leading thinker that favored inductive method, scientific method based on experimentation and observation. Then came the Enlightenment philosophy of the 18th century with figures like Voltaire, David Hume, Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, Edmund Burke, among others, some of the important thinkers representing the best exemplars of that thought, Enlightenment thought. And also you can use some American like Jefferson and other who wrote the Declaration and the Constitution, Madison, and some others. Then some different perspectives, such different perspectives as Romanticism, realism, and positivism exploded in the 19th century. The names of different thinkers are too many to mention, but I'll just say, for example, Goethe, Victor Hugo are well-known romanticist thinkers. Charles Dickens is a realist writer. Honoré de Balzac, also a novelist. And Auguste Comte is the positivist that exemplifies these traditions. Romanticism prioritized emotion and intuition over reason. Realism sought to depict the world as it is without embellishments, not as we wish it were, right? And positivism kind of rejected all other methods but the scientific method as the proper means of gaining true knowledge about the world. So only science was seen as the way to know anything, even society, any field of knowledge. Only scientific method was the valid, and that perspective is still alive and today. So a lot of people, scientists, still think that way, that everything natural science, scientific methods are applicable to all areas of knowledge, but that's not accurate, and we will talk about that in the future. Certain areas such as humanities and society are not like natural sciences, and the same methods cannot be used investigating these areas of experience. Following all these developments came modernism in the early 20th century, which kind of reacted to the processes of industrialization, technological progress, and the resulting social upheaval. Modernism sought to upend tradition, question the received norms, explore all the new ways of thinking about and seeing the world, right? So abstract thinking and painting and all arts, literature, like stream of consciousness writing, many changes and revolutions were made to how you speak about the world, how you see it, how you perceive it, how you process that information. Cubism, all kinds of Dadaism, Surrealism, all those Futurism, all those different schools of art and thought developed during this time. And a very rich intellectual ferment during this modernist period, which preceded World War I, which when everything kind of ended and the world crashed and things weren't the same afterward. Ultimately, this process of development may be seen as culminating in the contemporary organized secular humanist perspective, as it was summarized in several successive humanist manifestos of 1933. The second one came in 1973, and the third one in 2003. I will link to those, and you can read and compare them and see how the humanist thought developed in the recent century. Secular humanism, of course, is not the only contemporary variety of humanism possible. Other varieties existed and continue to exist alongside the secular tradition, such as various religious humanisms, Christian, Buddhist, Unitarian, Universalist, which is also Christian, but it's a more of a eclectic tradition, mixing different different kinds of thought, not just Christian. Existentialist humanism, of Sartre and Camus, the French existentialist writer, Simone de Beauvoir, also the feminist writer in the existentialist tradition, focusing on absurdity of life, ethics of ambiguity, authenticity, and freedom to create your own meaning in world. Then there is Marxist humanism. Such thinkers and psychoanalyst Erich Fromm wrote about a lot of from psychoanalytic perspective, but also using Marxist thinking. And George Lukács, which was a Hungarian Marxist and communist politician and also philosopher and critical thinker, and he there were others, but they focused on social justice, class struggle, alienation, exploitation, and supporting efforts for towards liberation and a more increased human agency. And then there was also a scientific humanism of Julian Huxley. Was the main proponent, emphasizing empiricism and scientific and technological progress. This perspective is also important for future videos, because scientific humanism, because it was both a perspective that helped found UNESCO. It's a UN agency for the cultural preserving cultural heritage. So it was based on this scientific humanist perspective, but it also, Huxley was the first to, I think he was the one who coined the term transhumanism, and that's transhumanist perspective we will be discussing next time, is one of the larger field of posthumanism, and we will look into that next time, as I said, next episode. So while this is a very truncated and a simplified schematic overview that I just proposed, it will suffice for now, and one might say that humanism declined as a result of its own success, right? So this progression through the centuries to the modern day, humanism in some ways was successful, but proliferation of knowledge that eventually led to specialization and professionalization of science and learning became, it was inevitable because Renaissance kind of emphasized learning and science and new knowledge, and the more knowledge accumulated, the more difficult it became for one human mind to encapsulate it all and just process all of that information and knowledge and be in control or be in command of that knowledge, as it was much easier in the Renaissance times. The figure of the well-rounded Renaissance, quote-unquote, Renaissance man, combining contemplation with action, theory with practice, academic and scientific projects with political and economic pursuits, that figure faded away and nearly disappeared in our times, from our horizons. Not quite, but for the most part, it's no longer a dominant. We are all very specialized generally, and this disappearance has been gradual and never quite complete, as I'm saying. But even as recently as the interwar period, as a century ago, during the interwar period, there were many excellent, remarkable minds, novelists, journalists, and so on, scientists, who were produced by the humanist education. They were still trained in logic, rhetorics, and so on. They learned Latin, even Greek in schools back then. But unfortunately, there are warnings about the coming after the disaster World War I. They were warning even before that. The world was sleepwalking into a war, and then World War II was also predicted by some of them, but nobody really listened, and everybody ignored those voices, unfortunately. I'm thinking of such modernist writers as, especially in German tradition, German novelists, Hermann Hesse, Thomas Mann, Hermann Brock, Franz Kafka, and some and many others, and not just Germans, but those are the most prominent ones from that era. And so then the genocidal frenzy of the World War II transitioned almost seamlessly into the Cold War. The technological predominance of the industrialist system kind of became globalized, and this system of commercialism further prioritized narrowly instrumental and specialized technical education, now known as STEM, right? And with additional focus maybe on business and managerial occupations, along with some other more traditional professions like lawyer, doctor, and so on. But most of that happened at the expense of the humanities, and this more philosophically broader and in historically more contextualized perspective on humanity. That was sacrificed to this more specialized and instrumental education towards, like, you need to know how to do this to perform your function at work, and you don't need to think about philosophy and about what it all means and about what humanity is and what the purpose of life is. Just do your job and keep your head down, right? So that's I'm simplifying, but that's what I'm talking about. So part of my motivation for creating this channel is to assist in reviving interest in this more holistic perspective on humanity, preserving the core concerns which I mentioned: human dignity, human ability to progress in certain ways, and free will and autonomy to create meaning and make choices in life, but at the same time to adapt those core concerns to adapting the rest of the humanism, those that are not core, that may need to be revised, to the new contemporary realities, and which is, technological advances and AI and all these other things, which are, you can't ignore those. And that's what metahumanism and posthumanisms of all kinds, which we will discuss in the next episode, that's what they do. They specifically, metahumanism tries to preserve the core of humanism and adjust it to the new realities. And so that's a good place to stop. This episode is a little longer than the previous ones because it's a central and important topic, the meat of the issue. As always, please support Ukraine. I will provide the links in the description to the video and on my YouTube channel and on my social media. You can find that information easily, and support my efforts. If you like the content so far, I would appreciate your support. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.